Hello and welcome to Azure Live Mert to the Future. I had to give a short break, but now we are back with Heini Ilmarinen. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Very good,
And
actually.
thank you. Welcome, Heini. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I am fine. Thank you. So before we start, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Heini Ilmarinen and I am from Finland. So we are at the very darkest time of the year currently here. And I work as a DevOps consultant myself in my kind of daily work. And I also do a lot of speaking for the last year and a half. Of course, it has been mostly online and all that. And I also am 1/3 of the Knee Deep in Tech podcast as well. So all kinds of exciting things, in my opinion, of course.
Okay, great. So today we are going to talk about Azure Bicep.
Yes.
And so what is Azure Bicep?
Well, hopefully after this session, you'll have a good view of that. And today I'll be particularly talking from the perspective of creating an Azure data solution. But of course, everything that I will tell you today will be directly applicable to creating any resource in Azure. So you'll gain the foundation that you need to get started. So I think you all might remember that a while ago, once when you were talking about using infrastructure as code to create Azure resources, what you would be told to do is to use ARM templates. And, where's my slides? Sorry. You would be told to use ARM templates. And as you know, ARM templates actually weren't very easy to create. And it would actually take quite a lot of time to be able to create those and make your solutions using ARM templates. So it wasn't really something that was easy to use or very fast to get started with. And it might have been that once you tried a bit at it, you kind of got discouraged and figured, well, I need to get this environment set up. And you would, for example, switch over to just going to the portal and clicking around and creating your resources in that way. And it's completely understandable. I was also one of those people who started very enthusiastic, but then it seemed like a lot of work to get your environment up. But in theory, what would happen is that once you deployed your ARM template, you could deploy all your Azure resources, whatever they might be. Azure Data Lake, Azure SQL, even virtual machines, virtual networks, etc. It's kind of the sky was the limit. But luckily, since the syntax isn't very easy with ARM templates, we do have nowadays a lot of other options. And the Microsoft native way, the Azure native way that we can do that is Bicep. And that is exactly what we will be talking about today. That's our main focus. And so to really get to the heart of how do you use Bicep, we're going to start with a brief introduction to infrastructure as code. Then we're going to look at what do you need to get started with Bicep. And lastly, we're then going to look at how does your workflow change when you use Bicep. And especially if you're working with a team, it's going to be quite different from what you're probably used to if you're used to working in the Azure portal. So I already told you an introduction about myself. I work as a DevOps consultant at Polar Squad. I'm a Microsoft MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer as well. My favorite topic is to talk about architecture besides DevOps stuff. So today we're going to be more on the automation side of things, but that is my other passion. And also I have a background in mathematics. So I, of course, have a more soft spot for that still as well. And you might notice that I'm also a bit of a serial doodler as well. So let's get right to it and start with a bit of an introduction to infrastructure as code here. And so in the most simplistic way, if you think about infrastructure as code, this is the way in which you would define the resources that you want to create, whether it's in Azure or on any other platform. You define these in a configuration file. And based on that configuration file, then those resources get created. And so in this configuration file, what you can tell is, for example, the name of the resource, the location, and any other parameters that you can set for it. For example, the SKUs, and for example, for a virtual network, you would set the address space. It always depends on the resource, what kind of things can you really set there. And so then, in theory, then when you pass this configuration, that would create or either change the configuration of that particular resource that you are working with. And so, sounds very simple. And so for Azure, what options we have? We, of course, have the ARM templates as the one that has been around for the longest time. And nowadays we have Bicep. And we'll talk about more what is the relationship of these two things in a little bit. We also have other options that are not, Microsoft tools themselves. And we, for example, have Terraform, which is something that we use a lot in our company for deploying our customer environments. And also then we have Pulumi in there as one of very widely used options as well. But what is common to all of these different tools that you have available is that these are declarative. So what that means that you are only telling what is the end state that you're trying to reach. You're not telling, create this resource first and then this one and so forth. We're just saying, please create these resources and I don't care how you do it. Just the end state. And due to this fact, what we also get is idempotency. And what that means that we can run this same file again and again, and we will always end with the same end result. No matter if there's any resources there to begin with or no resources, etc. So with these kind of particular qualities of using infrastructure as code, we notice that it is not quite the same as using scripting. For example, doing PowerShell or Azure CLI and creating your resources through that. Because with those tools, you need to make sure how you handle, for example, the situations where the resources already exist. So it's kind of, you need to handle certain situations a little differently. Also, you need to then know that, for example, to create a virtual machine, you first need to create a network interface card and then the disk, and then as the last step, you create the virtual machine. So with this declarative syntax, it's kind of easier. You don't need to know in which order you specifically need to create certain resources. You just set the end state and off you go. So that is kind of what is the base for all infrastructure as code. But of course, the question then stands, well, why should I do it this way instead of, for example, scripting or going into the portal, etc.? And one of the aspects is that while you're doing infrastructure as code, you're getting also some documentation out of it. You have like a simple way in which you set your configuration. So you're able to see like what are the specific settings of your resources. The one thing here that I would take with a bit of grain of salt is that I don't think it's so easy to see the relations of resources if you just look at the configuration file. So you might need to have some overview pictures of the entire setup and how different resources are related to each other. But actually in Bicep, we have something for that aspect as well, which I will show you later on. But you might need to kind of, in general, with infrastructure as code, you might need to fill your documentation a little bit with some high-level pictures. The other aspect here that is a real benefit is that you are able to achieve repeatability. So in theory, if your environment needs to be reset completely, you can just delete everything and run the configuration files that you have again and end up with the same environment that you had before you removed the resources. So that's I think one of the biggest benefits, and especially if you're like in an environment where you need to get, for example, an identical test environment to the production, then it's easy to deploy that with just a few parameter settings that you change. And lastly, I think one of the big things that is more and more prevalent also in the infrastructure side is that we are able to use version control. So if we, for example, make a configuration change after which things just break and we're not sure what that breaking factor is, we're able to return to the previous state by using version control and then just kind of taking out the parts that didn't work and going to the previous version of our configuration files. And so I think those are really benefits that we need to be looking for our infrastructure as well. It'll allow us to troubleshoot faster, solve any issues faster, and just have a more controlled environment where we know how changes are happening.
So may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
In the previous slide, you talked about the different options for infrastructure as code, like Pulumi, Terraform, ARM templates, and
Yes.
also Bicep. How can I choose the correct option? For example, let's imagine that I know everything about all four options. I'm an expert of Terraform, Pulumi. So which one is the correct one to use?
So I think it depends a little bit on the environment. So it's good to remember with Bicep that is and ARM templates that they are Azure specific. So you can use those for managing and creating your Azure environments, but nothing else. With Terraform and Pulumi, you have more options of the platforms that you can manage with them. There is also then the drawbacks that with the ARM templates and Bicep, you get all the features, new features of Azure to be used right away in those configuration files that you create. Whereas, for example, in Terraform, it takes time because, for example, Terraform uses the Go SDK. And so it takes time before the new APIs become available there, and then Terraform is able to use those. So things come with a delay, and sometimes it's a bit longer, sometimes it's a bit shorter, so it can take time. But, and also with Bicep, it's good to note that it is just for Azure resources. And so, for example, if you also need to manage Azure AD, that is not an Azure resource. It is, yes, a Microsoft service, but it's not an Azure resource. So we cannot even manage Azure AD with Bicep at this point. So I would say that if you are just doing Azure, then Bicep definitely has the functionalities that you need. But you need to kind of then understand that if you do have some other platforms that you're using as well, you might need to use other tools there too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And so we're, of course, going to be talking about deploying to Azure specifically today with these infrastructure as code tools and specifically Bicep. And so I want to take a little bit of a look under the hood into Azure, how it is set up. So you have probably heard of the Azure Resource Manager, and that is kind of the management plane of Azure that we use. But behind the scenes, what happens is that we have these different resource providers. And it means that, for example, Azure Storage, we have a Microsoft Storage resource provider. We have a different provider for the Azure SQL. We have a different provider for Data Factory. We have a different provider for networking, etc. And all these providers provide their own APIs, and they update those APIs as new features come into those services. And those APIs define what kind of actions you can do on these resources, what kind of settings they need, what kind of management operations you can do on them, etc. And so what happens when you're managing your Azure environment, whether it's through the portal or other tools, is that you are interacting via the REST API of the Azure Resource Manager. And then whatever you're asking gets then routed to the backend resource providers in the right order. So for example, if you're using the portal and you go to click and create, let's keep the virtual machine example in here, it would go to the different providers to create the storage, to create the networking, and to finally create the compute itself. So then the resource manager takes care of all that, how those actions go behind the scenes. And then on top of this REST API, some of these tools that we use are talking directly with it. But for example, as I mentioned, Terraform there, that is, for example, communicating through the Go SDK. But there are also other SDKs that are available, so software development kits. And when we are using an ARM template, that gets passed directly to the REST API. And that is what makes it so that you always have the latest capabilities available to you. And so if we also look into the Azure portal, we can kind of see this structure behind the scenes. So if, for example, we go into the export template part that we can find at resources and resource groups, we find the configuration of each resource in this format that we would also use for ARM templates. So it is this capability that we have this kind of configuration syntax in a machine-readable way available for the resources that makes it possible for us to even use infrastructure as code. So that is what really sets up the base for us to be able to use this. Then we get to the more specific Bicep part. How do we really get started? What do you need, like specifically on your laptop, etc.? What are the steps that you need to take? So we know that what happens behind the scenes in Azure, and then you want to start working on Bicep on your laptop. So what you're going to need is that you're going to need, of course, some kind of text editor. And what I would recommend is the Visual Studio Code, because it has a really nice Bicep extension that makes the authoring a whole lot easier for the files. And in addition to that, you need either Azure CLI or PowerShell, because you're going to do the deployments using one or the other option. And I think the most recent versions of Azure CLI already have the Bicep installed, but you can install Bicep either using PowerShell or Azure CLI yourself. And I can provide the link maybe at the end. I don't think I can grab it right now. But there are good instructions on that. There's also, of course, a downloadable package available that you can then use if you're, for example, setting up Bicep for your DevOps environment or anything like that. So there's many ways in which you can do that. So, yeah.
Any minimum required version for PowerShell? For example, can I use PowerShell Core?
I think you can. I have to say that I myself personally use Azure CLI so much that I can't remember the details for PowerShell, but you can definitely find the requirements in the documentation where there's the information for downloading this. So it's easily findable.
Thank you.
So once you have Azure CLI or PowerShell and you have Bicep installed and you have some kind of text editor, then you can just get to creating your Bicep files. And they are actually files with this Bicep extension to them. So nothing fancy, very, very simple. And then what actually happens behind the scenes is that when you then run the deployment, this Bicep gets transformed into an ARM template that then gets passed to the REST API. So the Bicep is really almost like a shim in front of the ARM templates that makes the authoring a whole lot easier and makes the syntax so much easier to understand and create. And you'll see in a bit like how easily you can create your first resources. Yeah, that's how we get started. And then lastly, before we get hands-on, I want to address this, why would you use Bicep? I kind of covered this a bit with Mert's question as well, but the main benefit I see here is that you get to use the Azure APIs directly and all features are available to you right away. And it is kind of bothersome. I also work in projects where we use Terraform. It's kind of bothersome when you can't implement something with it. You have to come up with all these workarounds and things like that. So it slows you down. With Bicep, on the other hand, we get to use the APIs directly. And so it means that there cannot be any errors in the SDKs or anything like that either, because it is the APIs directly that we're calling. Also, compared to the non-Microsoft options that are out there, the other benefit here is that you don't need to manage a state file, because Bicep compares directly with the environment that is in Azure and just checks is there some changes that need to be made. So that makes it a whole lot easier. The one thing that I actually forgot to write here is the fact that Bicep also does a pre-flight. So it will, before it deploys, it will do checks like see if you have any policy restrictions in place. It will see if you have the credentials to deploy something. So it will do those pre-flight checks that it does in the portal as well when you're creating resources. And so that is something that is, for example, not present in Terraform either. So sometimes you run something and you run into an error way further along the way once it has been running for a while as well, because it's not able to do those pre-flight checks that are native to Azure. And that means it's time for us to kind of move on to our first Bicep deployment. And we're just going to start building one piece at a time, and I will be kind of highlighting some important things to note as we go along. And what we're going to be aiming towards is we're going to be creating a resource group, and then we're going to be creating a storage account in there, and as a data lake, as well as an Azure Data Factory and a SQL. And let's see how far we get with the pieces and go from there. All right, are you ready?
Yes, and let me make it full screen.
Yes, let's do that. So, all right. Just gonna turn my screen a bit here so I see better. So you can see I have a empty folder here that we're gonna start building our Bicep solution in. And so what I can do to begin with, I can just create my main file. This is where I will create all the definitions for my resources that I'm going to make. And so I have already Bicep installed here. So you can see it notices that I'm creating a Bicep file and takes care of all that for me. So I don't have to worry about that aspect of it all. So let's say we want to start with our storage here, for example. So what we can do is we can just start searching the different resources that are available. And so I can go resource and start just typing storage, and it will give me this suggestion of like, this might be what you want to create here. Does this look good? And so it gives me kind of a base configuration that then I can start filling in. And so all I need to do then is, of course, to fill in the defined requirements that are needed here. So for example, if I want to create a storage account with this name, and then I want to use storage version 2, premium, locally redundant storage as well. That all looks good. And then you can notice this one. It is referring to the resource group and the location of that. And so what it is doing is that it is grabbing the scope of this file that I create. And the default scope for the deployment that I'm going to do using Bicep is actually a resource group, which is like, if you've been doing things with ARM templates for a longer time, you might remember that that was the case once upon a time, that you could only do resource group locations. And so it is also, resource group deployments, not locations. And it is also the default setting for Bicep as well. So it will grab the resource group location that we deploy this to. And then if I want to add some other properties, I can, for example, add that I want to make this into a data lake. So I would use this is HNS enabled, so hierarchical namespace. Is that enabled? And I can just set true to it. And so pretty easy. I get all the configuration here that I need. So I'm actually going to make this just standard. And there is our first resource definition in place. And that is actually all I am going to need to be able to make my first deployment. That's all. Before we get to actually deploying this, I do want to point out a few other things. So here after the resource, so this is just saying this block is a resource type. Then this here is a reference to this particular instance of the storage account resource in my definition. So this is just a name for within Bicep itself. And then this next part is telling what kind of resource am I creating. And then this last part is telling, well, which API am I using for this? So those are all telling different things for us. So I have this definition in place. This will be then deploying this to whatever subscription I am logged in with Azure CLI, since that is what I'm using here. If I was using PowerShell, it would deploy this to whatever subscription you're logged in there. So all I then have to do is do a deployment, and this is at the group level. And if I'm kind of ready, I just want to create it. I don't really care if it goes right or wrong. Then I can just say resource group here and give it a name. So I can just say like this. And then, no, I don't need a. I first need to create my resource group. I got ahead of myself. So since we are creating this deployment to a resource group, I first need to create that resource group. So first group create, and then for that, I'm going to give the name. And let's go with this and the location. Luckily, I started to type the location there of myself. So that will grab the subscription that I'm signed in with, and it's going to return to me that, okay, I have created this resource group and it's been successful. And so now that I want to do the deployment and I want to deploy to a resource group, I'm just going to specify group and just going to say create, and then I have the resource group here. And this is where I need to hit the same resource group because that's where I want to deploy. And then template file is this main.bicep that I'm using. So it should be good to go. And I do have to put in the location here. Sorry, I must have. Sorry about that. I think I also missed the name of the deployment as well. I must have miswritten here. Let me just make sure I don't get sidetracked here. So I want to
set the resource group.
Yes, that resource group. I don't need the location. I'm sorry. I need to give a name for the deployment itself, so I can call it Bicep deployment. That is the one thing that I need there. Let's take these things off. I'm not sure if I'm.
And also there's a typo in resource group.
Oh, that's why. Thank you. That's the issue. That's what you get for trying to live demo. Okay, that looks better. Thank you so much. That's why you sometimes need a second set of eyes when you can't see something. So that's just going to run. And if we were to go into the Azure portal to see what's happening, then we would be able to see this particular deployment happening here. So let me just grab. this over here. There you see it was successful. And let's make this a little bigger. I can find my resource group, and you can see that I have my storage account over here. All done. And it has the data lake storage hierarchical namespace enabled, just as I set in my settings as well. So quite convenient and easy to get started, to just get even just the first resource running and get the first deployment there. And so we have our first resource group and resource in there. The thing often is that when you are doing these deployments, it might be that you don't want to just create one resource group. And so if you were to just do one resource group at a time and keep the resource group scope, you would need to have separate files for each of those resource groups and deploy them all separately. That might be also what you want to do, but that might not be quite as convenient all the time. And so it is actually possible for us to also make it so that the scope of this is a subscription as well. So what we would do in that case is we would scope this here and say that our target scope is a subscription. And then it is going to tell us, like, wait, I'm getting some errors in there. We can only have a scope of resource group for this one. So what we actually under this subscription scope need to do is create the resource for the resource group. And so let's do this. There we have resource groups. And this is just for the name, how we reference it. And so then we get to choose the API for this one as well. And I'm just going to take the latest one that is available here. And so you can get the parameters or the settings that need to be set for this either by just starting to type. It will tell you what you need to do. I'm just going to use the same name that we had there, and then the location. West Europe. So we have a name and location. And you can see that the syntax is pretty easy. We just tell what is the setting, and then we give it a value as well. And so we're still getting this kind of like, oh no, this is not really liking our way of setting this. So what we're actually going to be doing here is that we might want to separate this to a separate Bicep file in its entirety and create a module where we then create all the data service settings that we need to do. So I'm just going to create a modules folder here and then create under there, let's just say it's called data Bicep file. And I'm going to copy this over. Out entirely, actually, and pull this over here. So we're just separating this into its own file so that we can have everything that goes into that same resource group within one file. And so then we can call that module. We have this module option here, and I'm just going to call it data. And I'm going to say, grab that file from the modules folder that I just created. And then I am going to tell what is the scope of this. And actually, I just noticed I forgot the equal sign there. That is one of the things I find it hard to remember coming from Terraform, where you don't have the equal sign between kind of these two parts. The syntax is a little different. But I want to set the scope, And the scope is going to be this particular resource group here. And then the name is going to be, let's call it data services. So in this main file that we have, we're telling that we're using a subscription as the target. So it'll grab the entire subscription that I have. And then we're creating a resource group in there. And then we are calling a module in there that is defined in this particular file. And that module just has that one storage account in there for now. We will be adding some more things in there, but that is kind of where we can start from. So the only difference that we need to do to our call here is that we, instead of doing a group deployment, we want to do a subscription deployment. And the one thing that we can also do is to check what if we were creating this deployment, what would happen? And then it will kind of run through the succession of what is the configuration that you have given. If you're not quite sure, what your deployment is going to create, then you can kind of double check that. And apparently I have spelling issues today. And of course, I just want to say sub and not subscription. Yes. There we go. What if is misspelled? Oh, yes. You're getting all the nooks and crannies of how not to type. Today, it is the little dash in there. Now I have too many parameters here. And actually, of course, I don't need the resource group either because I am using the entire subscription. So that's all we need. The wrong thing, resource group, not the name. And let's just give it a location. And the location isn't actually location of resources, but where you are, where it will kind of track the deployment itself. So let's make sure that I saved these. That one. That also is something that sometimes happens, that you forget to save the file that you've been working on, and then it happens that it doesn't actually run those changes that you've put in there. I'm actually not sure I even saved this file there, so we'll see what happens because of that. One, no change, one to ignore. So after you run the what if, you are able to see what kind of changes it would do. So it will update the following scope. So it will change it from the resource group to the subscription. And then it has the other scope where it will have this storage account that it will ignore because it's not actually making any changes there. So let's just run this without the what if and instead with a create. And let's see what comes out. It should not really make any changes because it's just, we're changing the scope. We have still the same resources in place, and then we're moving on from there. So this really allows, using these modules allows you to kind of group together your resources, that they're a little more manageable, and so that you have a full environment that is, for example, in multiple resource groups still in the same file. You have kind of the base there, and then it just calls these other Bicep files that are then called modules there. All right, success, excellent. Now I should have reminded myself after using Terraform so much how the commands again go in Bicep. And now we can continue in kind of expanding this configuration that we're doing here. So I'm just gonna grab a bit of resources here that I have done earlier so that we can just bring them over. Let's create a data factory. And then let's create an Azure SQL as well. And so one thing as you start creating these bigger environments is that you might want to use some kind of parameters. And what you would do is create a parameter, and what I have already referred in those clips that I just copy pasted over is that we have this namebase. And I can either set it kind of hard coded here, or I could set it so that it gets passed from the main module. And I'll just set it to this pattern that I've been using here. And then I can just interpolate that into my string here. So our data factory name will be df-Heini bicep, and that's it. And we're going to use the same one here in SQL Server and then the SQL database as well. And let's just make our SQL database password a little more complex. And you might be cringing seeing a password there, and we'll get to that in a little bit. No worries. We're going to return to that. So of course, we don't want to put the password here in real text. So we kind of have, once you get the hang of creating one resource, then it is just repeating the same pattern again and again. You grab the resource, you give it the name that you want to use within Bicep, and then you tell what is the resource type and what is the API, and then you set the required settings for it. And it of course helps if you've been working with those particular resources before, because most of the time those settings are the ones that you would also set in the Azure Portal as well. So for example, from working with Data Factory, I know you need to give the name and the location, nothing else. Then it gets to creating pipelines, etc. And with SQL Server, you need a Azure SQL Server and then an actual database within it as well. So, but if you do not know the specific settings that you might need, in the beginning especially, it's really convenient to use the documentation. Sorry, there's my screen. So this will probably become one of your favorite sites to use. So the Bicep on ARM templates library that is available, you can find all the different resources in there, and you can find the Bicep format that is used. And if you're, for example, familiar with the ARM templates, then you can even a little bit like compare, okay, all right, I knew how to do it in ARM, how do I do it in Bicep as well? So you have both samples over here. And there you will then also find like what are the required settings and what are the optional settings, etc. So you will find everything you need in here as well. So it's good to really put this particular URL to mind, and I will actually pop this in the chat to be shared with you so you can take a look yourself as well. And so that's the pattern you're going to be repeating, figuring out which services you'll want to deploy, figuring out how you deploy them, and then you are able to just run this same deployment again and again. And I hopefully save that file again to make it actually take those changes and create the SQL Server and the database as well. So we can let that run. And what brings a little more flexibility to these modules that you might want to use is that we could, for example, just create another resource group in the same subscription, and then we just have another module that we reference to create the specific resources in that resource group itself. And also, if I needed to, for example, I wanted to instead give this parameter here from the main file, I could even add that from this side. And then I just give the different parameters that I want to set. And I would give this, what was it called? Name base. I would just set this in here instead. And yeah, that's probably what you would want to do in your environment as well. So while this is running, we could, of course, then see these resources appearing here in the Azure portal as well. And the one thing with using Bicep that I have noticed is that sometimes if you do run into an error, it can be a little difficult to find the Bicep error message that you get might be a little kind of like, okay, what does this mean? But where you're going to be able to find that error message in more detail is here in the activity log. If you are, for example, doing the resource group deployment, or then in this subscription level activity log, you would find the deployment there if you're doing the subscription level. You can actually do these deployments at the management group scope as well, and then you would just have the specific subscriptions within there. So you can have quite extensive environments that you set with Bicep entirely as well. But we can see that this deployment that we did is on its way. We have created the data factory, and then the SQL server has appeared there. We don't see the database itself yet, but it is on the way. And as long as I gave it a complex enough password, it should be able to pass through with no issues. So the database will appear here in a little bit. Actually, it did right now. And now you can see I have this nice pattern here for the names as well, and can have that consistency across all of the resources that I have there. So the last question that you might be asking, like, well, how would you, like in real life, do this passing of secrets here? So one option would be that you would create an Azure Key Vault from here in Bicep, and then you would manually go in and put in the secret, and then after that, add the reference to that secret as well. The other option would be here to set this sensitive tab here for this parameter. And I am probably misspelling something again. Let's get first to this. So you would, for example, set a parameter first that is SQL server admin password, for example. And you would tell that, yes, it's a string, but you wouldn't give it any value. And then you would just reference that parameter that we have here. So SQL server admin password. We would just use that for the password. And then, of course, you don't want that to be printed out in anywhere. And so you do need that sensitive label for the parameter. And let me just quickly check that, because I've been having not so good syntax today. Oh yes, it's not sensitive. That's Bicep again. but we use secure. That is what we want to use. So this is what makes the parameter secure, so that it doesn't print it anywhere. And so you, of course, wouldn't want to put the value itself here, but you would instead want to, for example, then pass it from here. So if you want to have it kind of passed on from the command prompt itself, what you would need to do is also have the parameter here. As well, and then you would set the parameters here, and for example, set the SQL Server admin password. Sorry, no, and you would set it with this one. So this one is referencing this SQL Server admin password, and this is what is setting it for this module here. So that way, then when you are running this command, let's make sure I save these. It will ask you for that parameter and ask you to fill in the password for that SQL Server. And as you can see, I hope you can see from that low. And then I just want to make sure that I put in enough of complexity. And that way I'm able to set the password without it showing up in my code, without it showing up elsewhere as well. But it's maybe a little different. We don't have like a function within Bicep that you could use, for example, to create a password. You need to either have it pass through this kind of the command when you create everything, or on the other hand, you would need to have it, for example, in the key vault. And there you would have to have some kind of steps that you first create the key vault, then you write a secret in it, and then you reference the secret in here. That would be the other option to do this securely. So pretty much we have done our first Bicep deployment, meaning that we have created these specific resources in Azure using Bicep. You might have noticed that we haven't done anything at the data layer yet. We haven't put any data in the Azure Data Lake. We haven't done any tables in the Azure SQL. But it's good to know that with Bicep, your limits are where the limits of ARM templates are. So whatever you can do with ARM templates, you can do with Bicep. And so Bicep is not something that you would then use to deploy your database in there, for example, unless you're deploying it from a backup of another Azure SQL database. That would be something that you're able to do. But other than that, you kind of have certain limits to which you can go to, especially with data platform deployments. All right. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. So are there any challenges may I face while using Bicep with Azure pipelines or GitHub Actions?
Challenges. Was that the? So I think the one thing you do need to note when you're using pipelines, whether it's Azure DevOps or anything like that, is of course you need to set up kind of the credentials that you're running these commands with. And that is, I think, the biggest thing there. Then if you are using one of these tools, some of these also have capabilities where you can have like sensitive values stored in that particular tool, and then you can reference it in your pipeline. So that would also, they can also bring improvements to handling secrets as well. So that's kind of the other side there. But other than that, the process is very similar. What you might want to build into your pipelines is, of course, you might want to have first that what if step to check like what's going to happen when I run this. Or you need to have a process that whoever is kind of doing the changes with Bicep, that they first check from their own laptop with a what if, and then the actual kind of the deployment comes through the pipeline itself. But other than that, the process is very much the same, no matter if you're doing it from your laptop or from another pipeline tool of some kind.
Okay. Are there any best practices for Bicep?
There are, and there is even, I think, a Microsoft page for best practices that I remember seeing. I don't have the URL handy right now for that. But for example, whenever you're using any repeatable string parts in your naming conventions, have those as parameters. I think with the Bicep deployments, you want to have your limits kind of thought out in terms of teams. Like if, for example, you have one subscription for one team that is working on several applications, you can deploy all that from one set of Bicep files. Of course, it can be multiple modules and multiple files as well. But it depends a little bit like how is your organization structured, etc. But think about like how do you separate the different deployments from each other? Of course, when you're using a pipeline tool, even for that identity, give the least privilege that it needs. But of course, when it's creating things, it requires quite extensive. But if there are any kind of you have multiple subscriptions and you're just doing deployment to one, just have rights to that one subscription. And also with secrets, don't store those in your code, etc.
Okay, so this is my last question. And any recommendations for the beginners to learn Bicep, except MX docs?
Yeah, the documentation is really good. Also, there is a learn module for Bicep as well. And I would just recommend that get started in whatever way you have. Get, for example, an Azure free subscription for a month and just test it out. And because that is definitely the kind of fastest way to learn and pick up how does it actually work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Heini. This is a great session.
You're welcome.
And hope to see you in further episodes with different topics.
Yes, me too. And thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. So, see you soon.
See you.
See you. Bye.